Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW Starrcade 1996. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Ultimo Dragon versus Dean Malenko. Number one, I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between the Dragon and Malenko, with the Dragon keeping the pace of the match. Dragon then lands a kick combination on Malenko. Malenko then applies a Texas Cloverleaf on the Dragon, but the hold is broken. Malenko then hits a brainbuster on the Dragon in the middle of the ring for a near fall, but the Dragon ultimately hits a German suplex on Malenko, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is the Ultimo Dragon. Hats off to the Ultimo Dragon for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Women's Championship. It is Akira Hakuto versus Medusa. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Hakuto and Medusa, with Hakuto keeping the pace of the match. Medusa ends up hitting a devastating powerbomb on Hakuto. Sonny Ono then attacks Medusa, but Hakuto ultimately hits a brainbuster on Medusa, pins her for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW Women's Champion, is Akira Hakuto. Hats off to Akira Hakuto for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Jushin Thunder Liger. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Mysterio and Liger, with Liger keeping the pace of the match. Mysterio ends up hitting a head scissor takedown on Liger. Liger then hits a devastating powerbomb on Mysterio to the outside. Mysterio then hits an Acai moonsault to the outside on Liger. Mysterio then hits a springboard leg drop as well. Liger then gets to the top rope, hits a diving headbutt on Mysterio in the middle of the ring for a near fall. But Liger ultimately hits a Liger bomb on Mysterio, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Jushin Thunder Liger. Hats off to Jushin Thunder Liger for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Chris Benoit in a no disqualification match. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Jarrett and Benoit, with Jarrett keeping the pace of the match. Jarrett was unloading strikes on Benoit. Arn Anderson is here. He ends up hitting a DDT on Jarrett on the outside. Kevin Sullivan's in the ring. Benoit is distracted. Sullivan ends up hitting Benoit with a chair shot. Jarrett then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Jeff Jarrett. Hats off to Jeff Jarrett for getting a win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Kevin Nash and Hall versus the Faces of Fear. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Faces of Fear keeping the pace of the match. Ming ends up hitting a devastating pile driver in the middle of the ring on Scott Hall. Nash then ultimately hits a jackknife powerbomb, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Hats off to the Outsiders for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Tournament Final. It is Eddie Guerrero versus DDP. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and DDP, with Guerrero keeping the pace of the match. Guerrero and DDP both exchange in the middle of the ring. DDP then hits a devastating powerbomb on Guerrero for a near fall. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash make their way down to the ring. Hall ends up hitting a razor's edge on DDP. Referee is distracted. Guerrero capitalizes on this, hits a frog splash off the top rope on DDP, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW United States Champion, is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lex Luger versus the Giant. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Luger and the Giant, with Luger unloading strikes on the Giant. Giant ends up hitting an elbow drop on Lex in the middle of the ring. Giant was trying to keep the pace of the match. Lex then puts Giant in a torture rack, but Six makes his way down to the ring. Six ends up attacking Lex. Sting also makes his way to the ring. He pretty much whispers something in Giant and Lex Luger's ear. He ends up leaving the bat in the middle of the ring. Lex then goes for the bat. Giant puts his foot on the bat, preventing Lex Luger to grab the bat. But Lex ends up grabbing the bat, hitting the Giant, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Lex Luger. Hats off to Lex Luger for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW Starrcade 1996. It is Roddy Piper versus Hollywood Hogan. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Piper and Hogan, with Hogan keeping the pace of the match. Giant makes his way down to the ring. He ends up attacking Piper. Then a fan somehow climbs off the guardrail, climbs into the ring, attacks Hogan. Security tries to stop the fan. Piper then applies a sleeper hold on Hogan. And your winner of the match by submission is Roddy Piper. A couple things I'm going to say about Starrcade 96 before I get out of here, man. Number one, I've always been a big fan of Starrcades. Always. I think, to me, Starrcade, the way that they told stories for Starrcade, it sounded like, it was more or less WCW's WrestleMania. If you look at WrestleMania and, the amount of matches they had on WrestleMania, the storylines leading up to WrestleMania, they were solid matches from top to bottom. You look at Starrcade, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you look at Starrcade and some of the matches they put on. I mean, look what they did for Sting. I mean, Sting took almost an entire year off, pretty much a year off, and did not return in the ring until, I believe, Starrcade 1997. But at the same time, it was a storyline that was built pretty much almost on 2 years. And it was to me, it was one of the best storylines WCW put together, in my honest opinion, because a lot of people love Sting. Even till this day, and Sting is still wrestling. He wrestles for AEW, and he's been teaming up a lot with Darby Allin. But despite AEW, you look at, the storyline between Sting and Hogan and how that all came together at Starrcade 97. It was one of the best storylines, pretty much the best storyline WCW ever put together, in my honest opinion. I mean, they had this guy on the shelf for 2 years. Now, we saw Sting in the rafters and, obviously making threats to the NWO, Hollywood Hogan especially, but they never faced off in the ring until they waited a whole year later at Starrcade 97. So that's the reason. Long story short, is what I'm saying to y'all is that, Starrcade was always synonymous with WCW. And to me, it was always something that was like WCW's WrestleMania. Now, even though WrestleMania is usually around April or March, back in the day, sometimes they had, WrestleMania in March. Now, more or less, it's more in, April. But Starrcade usually was around, Thanksgiving or, December, that kind of area. Mainly Thanksgiving time. It was usually around what Starrcade was, on, if you will. But to me, it was always one of those events that's synonymous with WCW. And they put on fantastic matches. With that being said, though, do I think this card was the best Starrcade card they put together? Absolutely not. No, not even close. For a couple reasons. Number one, the women's match, Akira Hokuto versus Medusa. A lot of people are probably going to be against, women, WCW having a women's roster. I think WCW should have had a women's roster, to be honest with you. Because at the end of the day, they created the WCW Women's Championship, but they really didn't have a women's roster. I mean, the only woman they had on that roster as far as a woman, like wrestling, was Medusa. So, I mean, you only had Medusa, then you brought in other talent from New Japan, or Japan for all that matter, like Akira Hokuto or Bull Nakano. They weren't really signed exclusively to WCW except for Medusa. So it wasn't like they had a strong roster for women to, challenge for this women's championship. So, as you could tell, if you guys watched WCW, that championship did not last long. The cruiserweight matches, and I stated this multiple times in the past as well, man, the cruiserweight division for WCW, and I'm going to continue to keep saying this until the end of time, is severely underrated. I mean, the opening match, you have Ultimo Dragon versus Dean Malenko, and I mean, honestly, a lot of people probably don't know much about Ultimo Dragon. To me, I think Ultimo Dragon is one of the best cruiserweights of all time. Even in, his tenure in WCW, I mean, he was pretty much walking around with, 8 championships around his waist. I mean, just from him winning championships over in Mexico and Japan, winning the J Crown Championship. I mean, Ultimo Dragon is an absolute legend. And for that, Malenko and Dragon to have a match, and not only a match, but to open Starrcade 1996 for the Cruiserweight Championship is awesome. I mean, even Dragon won this match and became the WCW Cruiserweight Championship, adding to the belts that he already came down to the ring with. So you got to give credit where credit's due, number one. Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Jushin Thunder Liger, another dream match, man. I mean, Mysterio people can say what they want about Mysterio, but at the end of the day, to me, in my honest opinion, I've been watching wrestling for a very long time. Mysterio was one of those guys that kind of, brought in that luchador aspect and just, took it to a whole other level. And he really brought a limelight into the luchador type wrestler into, the American fans. I mean, because a lot of, obviously fans in the States were not going to know a lot about AAA, CMLL. A lot of fans weren't going to be, gravitating towards, wrestling in Mexico, which, I mean, yes, now we get, now we have YouTube and stuff like that, and we can, watch tapes of AAA. But AAA had a lot of good wrestlers coming out of that promotion. I mean, Conan was one of them. You had Conan, you had Guerrero, you had Juventud Guerrera, you had guys, Psychosis. I mean, that's just to name a couple guys that came over from that promotion or has done work for, those promotions. And when Mysterio came into WCW and the moveset that he brought in to the fold for WCW, a lot of American fans in the States had never really seen that. It's not like you're going to see, the Giant doing a backflip off the top rope. Now, would it have been incredible? Yeah. But Mysterio brought a whole new dynamic to fans that fans in the States never really understood or never really got to see that type of wrestling. And I think when Mysterio came into the fold with WCW, you really got, you got to understand what it was like, or what it's like to wrestle in Mexico and being a luchador and stuff like that. A lot of high-flying moves that a lot of people in the States as wrestlers were not doing. And I think with Mysterio doing what he did, I think he changed the game for a lot of, wrestlers for the future, even that present day. I mean, the guy's an absolute legend. I mean, Jushin Thunder Liger is the same thing. I mean, how many times has he won the, IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship? I mean, Jushin Thunder Liger is an absolute legend. And even during this match, I mean, they were talking about, the size of Jushin Thunder Liger and, in this match. And he wanted to wrestle heavyweight. So, I mean, it's just, it shows what kind of career these guys had and what kind of impact they made in the wrestling business. I mean, Jushin Thunder Liger is huge over in Japan. I'm not going to sit here and say, huge as like an Antonio Inoki, but Jushin Thunder Liger was a big deal for New Japan Pro Wrestling. And Mysterio, I mean, if you're a kid watching, Mysterio wrestle, and like when I did when I was like 8 years old, I mean, Mysterio capitalized so many fans with the moveset that he did that you always wanted to see Mysterio wrestle, whether he lost or won. Because you never knew what kind of moves that he was going to pull out, in that matches. I mean, he could do like a Hurricane Rana or an Acai Moonsault. You never knew what you were going to get with Mysterio. That's what made him so mysterious in the ring. And when you're a fan or you're watching it, at a young age, and you're like, wow, you really capitalized, you're fixated on this wrestler because he got your attention. And that's exactly what Mysterio was really good at, man. He was great on capitalizing on the fans' reaction, and he always gave 110% in every single every match that he had. So, two absolute legends between Mysterio and Jushin Thunder Liger. Jeff Jarrett and Chris Benoit. I mean, I don't know how many times I got to tell y'all, man, I've never really been a fan of Jeff Jarrett. I think he's a mediocre wrestler at best. No offense. This was a decent match, but, looking back on it now, there was definitely some, storylines going on in this match. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there was legit heat between Chris Benoit and Kevin Sullivan. Now, some people know that and some people don't. There was legit heat between Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit. And the reason why was because of Woman. Woman played a big role in Kevin Sullivan's, career. They were also in a relationship together. And then, obviously Kevin Sullivan was working with WCW. And then they brought Benoit in, and then Benoit, and Woman kind of, obviously got together and eventually got married and so on and so forth. But there was legit heat between Kevin Sullivan and Benoit, and obviously at that time, nobody really knew what the hell was going on. I mean, until now, okay, there was something going on between Benoit and Sullivan. And I watched this, I watched the match a couple times, actually, and looked back at the reaction that Sullivan had once he hit him with that chair. And you could definitely tell that Sullivan was really legitimately, upset with Benoit. I mean, he didn't look like it was one of those things where it was like, yep, we're going to have this spot in the match, and then here it is. No, Sullivan looked legitimately, like, pissed off at Benoit, literally. So, you have that angle as well. Arn Anderson coming down, hitting the DDT on Jarrett on the outside. There was all different kind of storylines going on in this match, which made it really, really good. But Jarrett, unfortunately, got the win due to the help from Kevin Sullivan with the chair shot that he landed on Benoit. Nash and Hall defending the WCW Tag Team Championships against Faces of Fear. I said this multiple times too about Faces of Fear, man. It was one tag team to me that was severely underrated. Ming and Barbarian, those guys are legit units, man. Ming or Haku, whatever you guys want to call him, that guy is no joke. No joke at all, man. And to be honest with you, Faces of Fear they were beating the hell out of Nash and Hall in this match. I mean, it was to a point where I felt like, you watch the match and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had no idea how to wrestle these guys. I mean, it was to a point where, Ming and Barbarian were just destroying these guys in the ring. Like Scott Hall didn't know what was going on. They were, destroying Scott Hall, and a lot of it went on Kevin Nash. But, hats off to Faces of Fear, man. Even though they didn't win the match, I mean, they were one severely underrated tag team and a powerhouse tag team at that. Guerrero and DDP, fantastic match. Big fan of Eddie Guerrero. Again, another guy that, legendary, wrestler. Comes from, wrestled in Mexico, obviously. Made a humongous name for himself in different promotions. I know he did work with AAA. He did some work with ECW, working under Paul Heyman for a little while. It had great matches with Benoit and ECW and Dean Malenko. And he just, Guerrero, a lot of people, love Rey Mysterio, and a lot of people love Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero was one of those guys that had the complete package, in my honest opinion. I mean, the charisma, the mic skills, the in-ring ability, the athleticism that Guerrero brought to the ring. You could put Eddie Guerrero against any guy in the ring who's a top contender, he's going to give him a match. I mean, I even say it to this day. I mean, imagine seeing Eddie Guerrero versus like AJ Styles, or imagine seeing Eddie Guerrero versus, Kenny Omega or Will Ospreay. I mean, it's insane, man. I mean, what he brought to the table as an in-ring performer and the caliber of athlete that Eddie Guerrero was severely underrated. And he's still missed to this day, man. Absolutely, absolute legend. But Guerrero, to me, the thing with Guerrero, he's one of those wrestlers, and it's hard to find it. Like, it's hard to, have a wrestler come into pro wrestling and be a heel or a babyface because, especially if you want to try to play both sides of the fence, being a babyface and a heel. And Guerrero pulled that off. I mean, when Guerrero was, feuding with Rey Mysterio, he was a great heel. Great heel. But a lot of people loved him as a babyface, man. And, the laugh, the giggles, the funny Eddie, coming down, to the ring and, the car and the segments that he had with Batista and, obviously Ray years later, Big Show. Just, funny moments that Eddie brought to the fans. And again, it's the same thing with Rey Mysterio. He brought in a new dynamic to professional wrestling that people just were gravitated towards and were it was like starstruck, man. And a lot of people didn't know what they were going to get with Eddie Guerrero. And again, he brought it to the table every single night that he wrestled. 100%. Absolute legend, Eddie Guerrero was. Lex Luger and the Giant, it was a decent match. I mean, I was surprised that Lex got the win. Lex Luger's another one of those guys, man, where it was like, obviously he did some work in WWE, and he did a lot of work with WCW. And, a lot of people were like, well, maybe his WWE run was better than his WCW run. There is no way in hell you can make me believe that his run in WWE was way better than WCW. No shot. And I'll tell you why. Because number one, in the mid to late 80s or early 80s, if you will, Lex Luger was the main guy for WCW, under the Crockett Promotions. The early NWA days. I mean, Lex Luger was the future for NWA and WCW before, obviously Ted Turner took over, Jim Crockett Promotions. Lex Luger was the guy. I mean, he had a lot of really notable matches with Ric Flair. He was, NWA US champion. He had really good matches with Barry Windham. Lex Luger was the next guy to fill that void, in my honest opinion, after, Ric Flair. That was my opinion on Lex. I thought Lex in the 80s was, the next Ric Flair. I'm not saying he is Ric Flair, but the way that they were grooming him at that time, was he was the next big thing, if you will, back in like the mid to late 80s. And, once he went over to WWE, you got like the Lex Express. And you see documentaries years later, and Lex hated being, in WWE. He hated his time there. He hated the Lex Express. It was brutal. He was miserable. And to me, I stated this multiple times in the past, I think Lex Luger's best in-ring character that he's ever had was the narcissist Lex Luger. When Bobby Heenan introduced it to the crowd, the narcissist Lex Luger, and you see him in the cave and everything else like that, he comes off as a narcissist because, his athleticism, his physique, you can definitely tell that, okay, this is a narcissist Lex Luger. He's better than you no matter what you may believe. And he's going to make you believe it whether you like it or not. But obviously the gimmick didn't last long. And then after that, he went back to WCW and, recreated his career, if you will. I mean, I believe it was sometime in 95 when WCW was at the first Nitro, Mall of America in Minnesota. And Lex, came down to the ring and pretty much told everybody that, hey, I'm in WCW. He got in the ring, got face-to-face with Hogan. It's the same thing I said about, Lex being the next Ric Flair. When Lex went over to WWE, they were trying to groom him to be the next Hulk Hogan. And that's why you had the Lex Express and Mr. America kind of deal. And they were really trying to make Lex Luger into a babyface and try to get severely over. And the only way they can try to do that was have Lex Luger go up against a behemoth of a man in Yokozuna. And, obviously Yokozuna, the way they built him, he's, from Japan. You had, the All-American Lex Luger. That was the only thing that could try to save his career. And to be honest with you, I might be biased on this. I know Hogan had left and went to WCW, but if they were going to groom some other wrestler to be in the echelon of Hulk Hogan, it should have been Bret Hart. Bret Hart should have been the one carrying that, that company on his back. And I think Bret Hart, I think a lot of people underestimate Bret Hart, honestly. A lot of people, the whole Montreal screw job and he left and all this other stuff. But as far as in-ring ability and in-ring talent, there's not many people that can stack up to a guy like Bret Hart, in my honest opinion. So, again, Lex Luger, I feel like his career was better in WCW than it was WWE. And I was surprised he won this match, but unfortunately, he got the win with the help of Sting and using Sting's bat to hit the Giant to get the win. Main event, we get Piper and Hogan. Again, it was a solid matchup, back and forth match, but Piper ended up securing the win due to a sleeper hold. Just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. I'm going to have to give WCW Starrcade 1996 a solid rating of a 6.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Starrcade 1996. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.